So it feels like every year, right? World leaders get together, they make these huge, ambitious climate promises. And yet, global emissions are still at a peak, and the planet's warming is actually speeding up. Now, it's really easy to just blame politics, but what if there's something deeper going on? What if the official science they're all relying on is telling them a story that's, well, a little too optimistic? I mean, think about it. For over 30 years, we've seen the same cycle play out. You have these major climate conferences, from Rio way back in 92, all the way to Paris in 2015, and every single time they're filled with these really strong words, urgency, ambition. And this quote from a vice chair of the IPCC, that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the big one. It just perfectly captures the frustration, right? After the latest round of talks, she called the outcome alarming and said we've moved further away from our goals, not closer. So, what is really going on here?
Okay, so this brings us right to our first big topic, promise versus reality. And look, we're all familiar with this story, aren't we? You have these ambitious climate talks that time and time again just fall short when it comes to actually cutting global emissions.
But here's where we want to push a little deeper. What if the problem isn't just a lack of political will? What if the scientific picture that all the policymakers are working from is itself a little too conservative, a little too cautious?
And that idea leads us right into our second section, science under pressure. We're going to dive into this hidden challenge, this idea of what's called scientific understatement.
So, what exactly is scientific understatement? Well, think of it as the tendency for these huge scientific bodies to kind of downplay the more extreme, high risk, worst case scenarios. And why would they do that? They might do it to get everyone to agree, to reach a consensus, or just to avoid being dismissed as, alarmist.
And you can actually see how the IPCC process itself can contribute to this. I mean, their main job is to summarize all the science for governments, but their reports have to be approved literally line by representatives from every single country. Now, on one hand, this gives the reports incredible legitimacy. But the flip side, it can mean that the strongest, most urgent warnings get watered down just to get everyone to sign on.
Okay, so this is where a really prominent scientist comes in who argues the risks are actually much greater than the consensus view suggests. This brings us to Section 3, Hansen's sobering calculus. His core warning is that Earth's climate is way more sensitive than many of our official models assume. And let's be clear, James Hansen is not some fringe figure. We're talking about the former head of NASA's top climate research institute. This is the guy who was one of the very first to testify before the US Congress about human-caused global warming, and that was way back in 1988. So when he speaks, his work really demands our attention.
So, Hansen argues that the official climate picture might be too rosy for three big reasons. First, he believes the climate is just more sensitive to CO2 than we think. Second, he points to this declining effect of cooling pollutants, these aerosols. And third, he shows that the planet's energy imbalance, the amount of heat it's trapping, is accelerating. Let's break those down.
Okay, so the first point, the crucial question in all of climate science is this: how much does the planet warm up if we double the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere? The IPCC's best guess is about 3 degrees Celsius. But Hansen, looking at data from Earth's deep past, the paleoclimate record, argues the real figure is much closer to 4.8 degrees. I mean, that is a massive, game-changing difference.
All right, Hansen's second point. This one is about aerosols from pollution. He says they've acted as a kind of accidental sunshade for the planet, a sunshade that, well, is now disappearing.
So here's how this works. When we burn fossil fuels, it doesn't just release CO2. It also releases particles like sulfates that make clouds brighter. And those brighter clouds do something really important. They reflect more sunlight back out into space. This has had this powerful but temporary cooling effect that's been hiding some of the warming. But now, as we clean up our air, especially with new rules for cleaner shipping fuels, we're essentially removing that sunshade, and we're starting to unmask the true amount of warming underneath. And this is the staggering result. Earth's energy imbalance has nearly doubled just since the early 2000s. Now, what does that mean? Think of this imbalance like a planetary bank account for heat. For a long, long time, the incoming and outgoing energy were pretty much balanced. But now, we're trapping far more heat than we're releasing. And that excess energy, which is mostly going into the oceans, tells us there's a huge amount of additional warming that's already in the pipeline, just waiting to show up. So what does all this mean for those big international climate targets we always hear about? That takes us to section 4, goals out of reach. Let's connect all this science back to that famous 1.5 degrees Celsius goal. And wow, this chart really puts it all into perspective, doesn't it? That first bar, that's the official carbon budget we have left to supposedly keep warming to 1.5 degrees, based on the standard models. But that second bar, that's what the budget looks like if Hansen is right. It's not just smaller, it's drastically, dangerously smaller. It's almost gone. So the conclusion here is pretty stark. If the climate really is more sensitive, and that cooling aerosol mask is coming off faster than we thought, then many of the pathways and plans that are supposed to be 1.5 degree compatible, well, they may no longer be physically possible. At all. This really forces us to confront a difficult reality. And that brings us to our final section, facing the real challenge, and the need to move beyond these overly optimistic narratives we've been telling ourselves. So here is the absolute core of the issue. The problem may not just be that our politics are too slow or that we lack ambition. The problem may be that the official story we're telling ourselves, the story that the 1.5 degree goal is still within reach if we just try a little harder, that story itself might be flawed. And this suggests that true, effective climate action needs to be faster, deeper, and more sober than anything that's currently on the table. It means we have to listen not only to the comfortable consensus, but also to the urgent warnings from the scientists who are looking at the high-risk, worst-case possibilities. And so that leaves all of us with a really critical question to think about. If the official story that we've all been clinging to is, in fact, too optimistic, then what does real, sober ambition actually look like?